Welcome to the overview of the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, Ecclesiastes is kind of a neglected book, I think, in our day, and I think there's several reasons for that. I think there's an emphasis on New Testament books, which is good. I think the size and the placement of Ecclesiastes in the middle of Proverbs and Song of Songs in the Old Testament means it gets kind of glossed over or just lumped together with the writings of Solomon. But I actually think one of the major reasons why we tend to skip over this book is because the content of Ecclesiastes is really hard to wrestle with. What we find in Ecclesiastes is a strong dose of the realities of living in a Genesis chapter 3 world. What I mean by that is we see and face and experience the realities of living in a world that's tainted with sin. Ecclesiastes does not try to sugarcoat life, but instead it looks at life in a way that at times sounds downright depressing. The author of this book draws our attention to the fleetingness of life and the meaningless pursuits that everyone is after, using the phrase under the sun, everyone under the sun. The author sets out on his own quest for meaning for life, and so the book really is formed as we follow the author in this quest for meaning and for fulfillment in life. And he concludes with this: all is vanity unless it is lived out in the fear of God. The proper fear of God will bring meaning to life. It's going to sustain God's people through hard life circumstances, and it provides a purpose that unlocks joy in the midst of life's mundane activities. So as we come to this book, it's going to sound hard and harsh. It's going to be hard to wrestle with the realities of death in every chapter as you read through it. But I think that the ending of all of the discussion is good for us because we'll consider our own lives and our relationship to death as we read it. Ecclesiastes is well known for a lot of pithy sayings. So if you've never read through the book, you've probably likely heard some of the sayings that are really popular. Sayings like vanity of vanities, there's nothing new under the sun, there's a time for every season, a time to be born, a time to die, time to weep and a time to laugh, time for war, time for peace. You've likely heard a phrase like, all are from dust and to dust all return. So there's a lot of familiar sayings out of this book that you'll discover as you read through it. Well, the author of Ecclesiastes is Solomon, and we see that in chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Solomon identifies himself here as the preacher, and it's the word for preacher that has become the title of the book, Ecclesiastes. The author calls himself this preacher or this speaker who is teaching to a gathered assembly of people. And it's actually the roots of this word are used in the New Testament that has become the basis behind the word that describes the church in Ecclesia. Well, we know Solomon as the wisest man who has ever lived. He's described as someone who's wiser than all who lived before him, all who lived after him. We find descriptions of how God blessed him with wisdom after he made him king of Israel. And it's during Solomon's reign that Israel reaches the height of their power and wealth and peace. Solomon began his reign with a proper fear of God. But as we trace the life of Solomon, as he became more wealthy, he gives himself to pleasure and he marries many foreign women who don't fear God, and they turn his heart away from God in his later life. And so Ecclesiastes may be his thoughts near the end of life. After having everything and forgetting his creator, he reminds us that the purpose of man is to fear God, and this will provide meaning and purpose in life that's more than what pleasure and fame can provide you. This book is really hard to structure. So if you're trying to find an outline to this book, it's really hard to piece it together. And the reason for that is because of how Solomon writes. He's not trying to lay out a linear argument like we would with our Western minds, starting with a statement and backing it up with reasons. In his mind, he's thinking more cyclically. So think big circles. He's going to introduce a theme, move on to another theme, and then another theme before circling back to conclude his argument, which sounds like his first theme from the beginning. And you'll find this cycle evident through the book as he moves from one thing to another and then brings the same thing up again. But there is a structure that we can outline. And here's what I have just for a really simple outline of the book. You'll find in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 23, Solomon outlines his attempt to find meaning in life. So he goes on a quest to find meaning and fulfillment, and he tries everything that there is to try. And then in chapter 2, verse 24, through chapter 3, verse 22, Solomon highlights that he's found meaning, not in everything that he's tried, but through faith in God. Solomon has found his purpose in God. Then we get to chapter 4, and we hit a really long stretch from chapter 4 all the way through the end of chapter 10. Here, Solomon describes life under the sun. And Solomon goes from one thing to another that he's experienced and witnessed in the world and explains how it's all meaningless unless it's tied to proper fear and proper worship of God. And the key to this whole section is chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, where Solomon describes what the proper fear of God looks like. Then we come to chapter 11. So all of chapter 11 is a description of faith and joy that's found in fear of God. And then chapter 12 is the call to response. In light of everything that Solomon has said, Solomon tells his readers to remember their Creator in the days of their youth and to fear God and keep His commandments. So that's just a really brief outline of the book to help you as you're reading. Well, why should we study Ecclesiastes? I think there are several reasons why. And the first is this. I think that we live in a day that is much like the days described in Ecclesiastes. We don't have to look far in our lives to find death or hurt or pain in our world, and we're all trying to interpret that. What do we do with death? Everyone in our world is in a pursuit for meaning and purpose. The answers of our culture are the same answers that Solomon went after, whether that's secularism, materialism, agnostic pursuits, or idolatrous pursuits. None of these things will satisfy. And so our society and the rest of the greater world we live in seems stuck in this cycle of life and death, and we're all left with the question, what is the meaning of it all? Ecclesiastes answers that question. The second reason we should read this book is because Ecclesiastes is written as a warning to you. The author wants you to understand your purpose in life. There's meaning and joy, but it's not going to be found in your pursuits of pleasure and fame or your wealth or knowledge. You will only find true meaning as you learn to fear God. As you grow in a proper understanding of God, life will be fulfilling and joyful for you, even from your youth. So as you read this book, heed the words of the wise old author of Ecclesiastes. He lived it all for you. He's tried everything, and he left you with this conclusion. What is the purpose of life? What brings life meaning? Well, here's the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And that's the book of Ecclesiastes.